University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil-military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Thomas Krasnican.
And I'm Sarah Claudy.
This episode is part 2 of a conversation we had with Dr. Ronald Krebs and Mr. Robert Ralston of the University of Minnesota. If you haven't listened to part 1, make sure to go back and do that first.
Last time, we talked about the classic theory of civil-military relations and the American public's deference to military leadership. Keep listening to hear Dr. Krebs and Mr. Ralston dissect these topics even further.
One thing that's come up a lot in our research for this podcast is the idea of ritualistic salutes to heroes or patriotic displays for the military in professional sports and movies and on public holidays. What are your thoughts on how that phenomenon kind of speaks to this whole idea of civilian opinion of the military and the current state of civil-military relations?
Well, what I would say is that is the popular analog to this elite emphasis on soldiering as a paragon, soldiers as paragons of citizenship. Right, those ritualistic salutes to heroes, it should be noted at least there is anecdotal evidence that veterans themselves really don't like it because it seems like a common, what great sociologist Michael Mann called spectator sport militarism. It allows people to feel like they are in fact supportive of the military when they have no real understanding of what goes on in the military and what it is to be in the military. But from our perspective, what's really dangerous about it is that it promotes hero worship. It promotes a set of stereotypes of the military that there is no way that our members of the military can live up to. And it encourages this popular deference to the military, this sense that America's soldiers are like other Americans, just a whole lot better. And that's not a productive from the perspective of civil-military relations.
So to get this right, your research seems to suggest that Americans in general don't recognize or don't internalize their responsibilities to provide civilian oversight of the military. I'm curious, was there ever an era in our history when Americans really did do that? Is it necessary for a functioning democracy for Americans to do that? And if they ever have, how did our country benefit from that?
I'll say a few words and then I'll turn it over to Robert. We don't know if the mass of Americans really ever took that seriously. What is disturbing to us is, are our elected representatives taking their oversight of the military seriously? Part of what inspired this research from my perspective, the event that really struck me was when David Petraeus, then the general in charge of Central Command, came to Washington, and it was watching a series of softball questions coming out of congressional committees that were supposed to conduct oversight. I don't know if the mass of Americans have ever taken that responsibility seriously, but once upon a time our Congress people did. And we do see we have fewer veterans serving in Congress than at any time in the last 60 years since the end of the Second World War. And does seem to be at least a sense that our Congress people who have not themselves had military service, who themselves have grown up in an environment, right? Most of them at this point are younger people. That is, if you are anyone under the age of 45, you have never known anything other than the volunteer force and never known anything other than this ritualistic salutes to heroes that you referenced earlier. And so we are not getting that kind of oversight out of Congress, and that is the part that is disturbing and I think does not bode well for American civil-military relations.
And the one thing that I would add to that is just in today's politics with the Trump administration, you see Trump being very deferential even in his rhetoric to the generals, my generals. And this only, I think, compounds this problem that the president himself seems quite deferential to people like General Mattis, the outgoing General Kelly, and General McMaster. And there was a lot of hair pulling when these folks were initially put into place because this sort of violated the norms of traditional gaps between the military and cabinet posts, right? And yet you didn't really see much of this being discussed on, for example, CNN or Fox News, right? This was much more a sort of insular conversation among people that were sort of national security experts. And I think the general tendency of someone like Trump to at least pay lip service to the military sort of exacerbates some of these problems of, in his own way, sort of this armchair militarism that he has as well as someone who did not serve. And unlike, for example, the recent passing of George H.W. Bush and the sort of stark contrast between their own history of service as well.
The important point, I think, to keep in mind is that it is, again, it's not clear that U.S. military policy is systematically better when civilians are conducting careful oversight or not. But because we don't actually have a way to answer that question. How would we know what a better military policy would be? How do we know what results are better for the nation? There's no way to answer that question without a deeper theory of democracy. And so the virtues of civil military relations cannot be weighed by asking at the end of the day, are fewer Americans dying on the battlefield? Are military operations being better designed? Ultimately, it's rooted in our faith and belief in the virtues of democracy, that ultimately it is civilians who are accountable to the populace, to the sovereign, because the people are sovereign, that it is civilians who have the right to be wrong. Now, that is the fundamental tenet of democratic civil-military relations. Look, all of us have come of age to some extent. Robert, I referenced the fall of the Berlin Wall. Robert referenced 9/11. And of course, 9/11 was a pretty big moment for me as well. I was just at the tail end of finishing up my dissertation at that time. The lesson of the decade after that was that civilians have the right to be wrong, and when they are wrong, as they were over Iraq, watch out. When they're wrong, watch out. But at the end of the day, civilians have the right to be wrong. If that is not the case, then we do not have a democracy.
All right, Dr. Krebs, Mr. Ralston, I have this question. Do military leaders recognize the amount of trust the public has in them? And is there any evidence that they're taking that for granted?
I think that it's clear. It's clear that we know this from speeches and so on, that they do understand, and they see those regular Gallup polls regarding trust in institutions. And I think it's very clear, the military leaders that I have interacted with, that is sort of the officers from colonel and above, they take that responsibility very seriously. But I do begin to worry that when based on our polling data with respect to veterans, I do begin to worry that they not only do Americans come to see them as somehow better Americans, but they will come to see themselves as better Americans, and therefore will trust their own judgment over that of civilians, that they will not come to see that civilians have the right to be wrong. That is, I think, sort of something that is of concern. I'm not worried that we're going to see an obvious coup in this country. That's not what the fear is. But there is a tremendous influence that all bureaucrats, and especially in the military arena, especially when you don't have veterans themselves serving in positions of authority, that the military can shape the decision-making process by setting the agenda. That if they themselves decide, we're only going to present two options, And they are both options that fall in the realm of what we deem acceptable. We're not going to present the options to civilians that we don't deem acceptable, but they might want and that are consistent with their priorities. That's of concern. So there are lots of ways that military officers who trust their own judgment can jimmy the process in a way that is going to allow it to produce results that they want to see.
Dr. Krebs, you've done a lot of work in the area of narrative and national security policy and how rhetoric shapes that. We were wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that research, and more specifically, how can Americans look out for rhetorical trends or techniques when they hear debates about national security policy in the public square?
Sure. We often tend to think that national security questions, what we call the arena of high politics, is an arena in which things like rhetoric and culture don't really matter a great deal. And what I've tried to show in my research is that that is not the case. The book I published in 2015 on narrative in the making of U.S. national security traced and sought to explain the rise and fall of the dominant narratives that shape our debates over national security policy. We cannot have conversations and meaningful debates, even the most wonkish of debates, are rooted, I argue, in a set of narrative presuppositions, a set of stories we tell ourselves about the world and about our country's place in that world. And those stories themselves have a deep impact on what kinds of arguments are sustainable and what kind of arguments we deem to be illegitimate or beyond the pale. And so my research has tried to understand how it is that those certain kinds of arguments have become dominant and how some arguments have that used to be dominant no longer come to be dominant. And the story and the argument that I make is rooted in the role of elite rhetoric and the responsibility that elites play for shaping those dominant narratives. And that provides the tie-in to the work that Robert and I and our colleague Aaron Rappert at the University of Cambridge in England that we have been doing. Because this is really the account that we're offering is one about the cultural politics of military service. That we have a particular dominant narrative of what it means to be a soldier that we are showing in this research deeply shapes how it is that Americans think about soldiering and military service, and as well more broadly about how they think about how sensitive they are to casualties, how favorable they are to military missions. And that is the link between those two elements of research. The military institution has always been, if you will, a cultural matrix. It becomes this screen onto which we project our national values in the West. And that goes back to ancient Greece, and that continues to be the case today. So the military is not just an institution for the application of force. It is also this flashpoint in our culture, which is why when I was coming of age in the early 1990s, that big flashpoint was gays in the military, right? The debates over don't ask, don't tell, and that's continued to be the case in the last quarter century, has been about the military as this flashpoint in our national culture, and will continue to be so.
All right. So we have a lot of classmates here at the Harris School of Public Policy who are going to go into careers that have nothing to do with national security policy per se, or defense. But summarizing from what we've been talking about, they have a responsibility to kind of learn about and engage with these kinds of issues anyway. We were wondering if you have any recommendations for people with no military background on how they should do that.
Well, I think some methods and resources for people to gain sort of a better understanding of national security policy. There's lots of resources out there. Websites like War on the Rocks, Defense One, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, these provide sort of a really nice synthesis of a lot of the stuff that's going on in academia, as well as the sort of policy debates and the sort of bridge between the two. And something that I'd recommend as a resource to people who want to keep abreast of issues is the text